The Gospel of the Lord. Every springtime, the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation offers an award to someone that it calls the Profile of Courage Award. And this award was designed quite a few years ago. They started giving it in the 90s. And it was to honor some public servant, usually an elected official, whether at the local, the state, or even the national level, who showed great courage in taking some position or performing some action that in fact risked a great deal to that particular person. It could have risked the person's status. It could have risked the person's acceptance by his own constituency. It could have been a great risk simply to his general popularity. And so in the course of the year, since 1990, when I think it was established, the award went to one of these elected officials who showed that kind of courage. And once in a while, there's been special awards given to some international figures, kind of along the same guidelines as well. That the annual award, of course, kind of grew out of the book, which I'm sure many of you may recall, Profiles in Courage. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book written by John F. Kennedy back in the 50s when he was still in the Senate. And in that book, the author gives a presentation on 8 senators, 8 U.S. senators that were deceased at the time, that go back in history, who in fact took some very courageous stand in some way, and so was considered a profile in courage. As I reflected on this particular award given to some political person, some elected official, I was thinking about how our church has its own profiles in courage. And of course, those would be known especially as our martyrs. We refer to the list of martyrs as the martyrology of our church. And as I mentioned on All Saints' Day, we have thousands of people that have been recognized by the church as saints, and going all the way back to the beginning. And going back to the beginning of our church, it was those martyrs that were first really venerated by the church as saints, because they risked so much in their life, even to the point of death, for the sake of the name, for the sake of the God of Jesus, for the sake of Jesus and his teachings. And that reminds us that in our, not just our Christian tradition, but in fact our Judeo-Christian tradition, there have been many who have been so faithful to God and to God's ways, to God's covenant, God's teachings, that in fact they even sacrificed their lives. The first reading today comes from the book of Maccabees, and it tells kind of an abbreviated version of this the story of these great heroes of Israel. This book comes to us, the story comes to us about 150 years before the time of Christ. And there was this woman named Hannah. She had 7 sons. And at this particular, they were all faithful Jews. And at this particular time, the Seleucid Empire kind of took over Israel. And King Antiochus was the king at the time, a pagan king. And he was trying to get all of his followers, in fact, to follow the gods of the Seleucid state or the Seleucid Empire. And so we have the story of these 7 faith-filled brothers, sons of this very faith-filled woman named Hannah, who were being forced to renounce their faith, the covenant living, and not just about not eating pork, but in fact the entire tradition. They were being forced to give that up, and they wouldn't do it. They showed great courage, incredible boldness and generosity in remaining faithful to the ways of their faith tradition, and all of the customs associated with it. And if you read the entire story in the book of Maccabees, you'll see that the tortures they experienced were just horrific. And what was perhaps the worst thing was that the 7 brothers were one by one slaughtered because of their faithfulness in sight of the mother Hannah. And Hannah herself was the last to be killed because she would not give up the faith as well. Profiles in courage within our own Judeo-Christian heritage. Certainly we know of and think of all of the martyrs that have gone before us who remain steadfast in the faith, even to the point of death. Many Catholic Christians in the Middle East are experiencing that same cost today, as so many are being slaughtered because of their faith. In the scripture, in the gospel today, Jesus is presented a rather incredible example, again, about 7 brothers and so on, but it really has nothing to do with martyrdom. It has everything to do with life after death, resurrection, as it's referred to in the gospel. And the Sadducees who approached Jesus, they're trying to show how ridiculous, they didn't believe in any life after death. And they were trying to show how ridiculous such a belief really is by coming up with this kind of crazy example about a woman who was married to 7 brothers, and whose wife will she be in heaven, and so on. And Jesus basically in his response is saying, you're missing the whole point. Life after death is so drastically different from life on earth, though there's a connection, that it's kind of crazy to talk about and to project our human experiences and our human understandings to life in the kingdom with Christ. Some say, and I think it's very true, that you don't have to believe in the resurrection in order to be courageous in life, in order to take courageous positions. But in fact, we who believe say and claim that it is helpful to have a belief in the resurrection, as we're called to make so many different sacrifices in life, even if we're not called to sacrifice our life for the faith. But knowing that we have a God who is eternal, knowing that there is such a thing as eternity, knowing that in fact there are values that Jesus gave us that are not just humanitarian, they're not just good values, nice values for this world, but they're lasting values, rooted in our eternal God. That belief makes it a bit easier for us to be courageous in sacrificing in this life for our faith and for the values of our faith. Even if in doing so we risk popularity with others, even if in doing so we risk rejection by the others, we can stand firm because we trust in a God who is faithful, we trust in a God who is eternal, we trust in a God who gives us lasting values to imitate. And as Jesus says in the gospel, the God we worship is not a God of the dead. He's a God of the living. And so may we be faithful to that God, even being willing, when called, to pay the cost of discipleship.